and welcome to this lecture on community participation in the just transition. A core principle of just transitions is that affected communities must be meaningfully involved in shaping the future they are being asked to inhabit. In this lecture and some of the following ones, participation refers to the involvement of communities in policymaking. In particular, our focus is on direct forms of engagement, where citizens contribute actively to policy choices. We will be exploring participation in the context of regional transformations towards sustainability, which include major social and economic changes, such as closure of coal mines or regional energy decarbonizations. Our main objective is to understand the factors, and in particular the barriers that may limit meaningful citizen participation. To guide this lecture, we are asking, why does participation succeed or fail? Research shows that there is often a mix of different types of factors that shape whether and how communities engage in policymaking. These factors can be grouped in three broad categories. Community factors, which include capacity or motivational factors playing out across communities, defining whether they are motivated or whether they have the capacity to participate. Policy factors that sit within the policy domain, for instance, how transitions or how sustainability is being framed by policies. And third, contextual factors. These include broader economic, social, or territorial conditions that define the broader environment within which participation takes place. For instance, we can think here of the nature or the scale of the transition. This lecture will focus on community factors, while the next one turns to policy factors, and suggested readings cover the contextual factors. Before we explore the community dimension in more detail, let's clarify which communities we are talking about and why their participation is valuable. This brings me to the notion of least engaged communities. We engaged with that concept as part of our empirical research and came to a working definition. A least engaged community is a group of individuals who are impacted by a transition in a similar way and who experience also a similar set of barriers to participate in transition-related policies. We can define these communities on the basis of different sociodemographic characteristics, such as their occupation, their age, their ethnicity or place of living, but it's often a combination of these characteristics that define a least engaged community. The participation of these communities is valuable for a number of reasons, but I would like to highlight two core reasons here. It matters because of the principle of justice, and here I highlight particularly distributional justice. The participation of diverse communities can really enhance the distributions of costs and benefits as part of a transition process. And this can ensure that sociodemographic imbalances or inequalities are not deepened through that process. But participation also matters because it strengthens knowledge, capacity building, and grounding of policies. It brings local insights, local experiences, and hopes that anchor policies in real places and real communities. Now, let's come back to our community dimension and our guiding question. Why does participation succeeds or fails? There are two key categories of factors, of community factors that affect their participation. These can be ability factors that define whether communities are capable to participate. We can think here, for instance, about whether participatory venues are accessible, whether information is available. There are also so-called willingness factors that relate to community trust, to their sense of empowerment or powerlessness, or whether they find the transition and transition debates as relevant. We've used this research to build this matrix that combines the two binary categories, able, unable, and willing, unwilling. It shows that these two types of factors can be combined. They can play out in combination. Some communities might be able to participate, but be unwilling to participate, or vice versa. And it also helps to capture that some of the possibly most vulnerable and marginalized communities are probably those that are both unable and unwilling to participate. In the following slides, I would like to zoom in on several of these factors. Starting with trust. Trust is a central motivational factor that shapes whether communities choose to participate in policy-making processes. In our empirical research, we've identified that most of the communities affected by transitions are unwilling to participate in transition debates because they do not trust the institutions that are leading them. But it's important to recognize that this trust is not fixed. It operates at different levels, and rebuilding it requires responses that match where the problem lies. At the deepest level, we found social distrust that is based on long-term and deeply rooted feelings of neglect, of exclusion, or betrayal by institutions. Second is relational distrust that stems from lack of contact. People cannot really assess whether they can trust institutions because they don't have a real tangible experience with them. And finally, the trust in the transition process depends on whether people feel the transformation is people-oriented, whether it listens, adapts, and brings tangible, visible benefits for them. The takeaway message for practitioners is that the design of participatory processes needs to be sensitive to the different sources, so different natures of distrust. Most probably require long-term relationship building that includes embedded and recurring participatory mechanisms. Relational distrust is addressed by making institutions more visible and more approachable through contacts that people can have in people's places with public authorities and the staff of these institutions. To illustrate this different nature of distrust, here I brought a few quotes from our empirical research. Defining institutions as parallel world to ours reflects a relational distrust. It echoes distance and disconnection, while saying nothing will change no matter what we do is rather a reflection of deep-rooted social distrust that is born of repeated disappointment. Still, there is optimism and curiosity among some of the groups, and that is evident in expressions like participating would be cool. A key motivational factor. Here we are talking about how do communities make sense of, or how they relate to transitions. Yeah, essentially, we are asking how do people make sense of these changes? Because structural transformations are complex and unfamiliar, people must interpret their meaning for their daily realities, such as jobs, housing, energy bills, and so on. And this process of sense-making or meaning-making depends on their context, on where they live, on their occupations, on their economic status, and their daily practices. So to understand the way communities relate to transitions and to transition policies, we can think of three analytical forms. First, tangible or material relevance that, for instance, relates to tangible assets like rivers or hard infrastructure skills. Practice-based relevance that connects with local rhythms and routines, or intangible and symbolic relevance that connects with values such as economic security or belonging. Now, of course, these categories, they don't operate separately in real life. They often overlap, but understanding relevance through these different lenses help understand the different meanings that people hold about transitions and about transition policies, and identify where policies connect or disconnect with these meanings. In our research, we found that relevance often acts as a barrier to participation because of two main reasons. First, some communities find that transitions and transition policies are abstract and hollow. They're difficult to connect with practical meaning. Other communities highlighted that transition policies were irrelevant. And this happens when policy objectives do not match or they actually clash with what is valued locally. For example, some of the coal mining communities we engaged with highlighted that some of the investments in their area did not utilize effectively the local skills that were available in the region. Or some of the rural communities, they noted that there was missed ownership opportunities in the way investments in renewable energy infrastructures were planned. And the final point I would like to make under this factor is that participation in the context of transitions is not only a technical or a cognitive process, it's also emotional. For some communities, especially those that are experiencing loss or disruption, the transition is first understood through what is being taken away rather than what they might gain in the future. Designing participatory processes, therefore, requires sensitivity to these different emotional starting points. Some groups will start in anger or in frustration, while others in optimism when imagining new development pathways. Making space for both and ensuring that the process avoids polarization can help actually build trust among these communities and create a safer and open space for genuine collaboration. We've been covering a couple of the motivational factors, but as I mentioned at the beginning, there are also the so-called ability factors. They define or shape whether communities can participate. Let me briefly unpack those factors. So, as I mentioned, these ability factors, they include different dimensions of accessibility. They also include whether communities have available time and resources to participate, whether there is knowledge that communities feel is required in order to participate. I would just like to briefly highlight a few of these factors and how they can pose a barrier to participation. In access to information, this is a real precondition for informed engagement. However, number of studies, including our own, highlights that making information available is not sufficient for meaningful participation. Information is often presented in bureaucratic form and technical language that makes it inaccessible for communities. In fact, some of the groups we engaged with shared that information is often communicated in one-size-fits-all approach, while they wished for more tailored communication approaches that actually target different communities. Additionally, trusted sources are essential. In an era of digital saturation, many communities rely more and more on trusted sources of information. These are often local intermediaries, familiar organizations or community leaders that can provide credible information and can mobilize the participation of these communities. Finally, distance to venues and the type of venue, whether it feels secure, familiar, or whether it feels more like an expert setting. This also affects participation. It can add additional layer of spatial or social distance and can explain why participation fails. So to conclude this lecture, I would like to highlight that engaging with the least engaged communities is not a single action, but a layered process that makes up different steps or stages that can respond to the barriers that communities are experiencing. And this is why understanding these barriers to participation is really a prerequisite, a first step in order to design successful and meaningful participatory processes. From our research, the lessons that we've learned show that on first place, this process needs to include steps that rebuild trust, that build emotional connections with these communities, and make communities feel visible and feel that they matter. So, in case you would like to learn more about the community dimension, I would recommend looking at some of the recommended reading material, and I thank you for watching.